Hi everyone, I'm Shree. I'm your English educator for grades 11 and 12. Our class happens every day from 3 to 4 p.m. except for Sundays. Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays are for grade 12. Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays are for grade 11. Because today is a Tuesday, we'll be starting off with our very first grade 11 lesson. Before we get into the lesson though, I want to tell you one thing. Today's class is pre-recorded. This means that I've recorded the class in advance and it'll be played for you at 3 p.m. So I won't be able to speak with you as class goes on. However, you're very welcome to leave any questions that you have, any comments that you have, any thoughts that you want to share, or even if you have answers to some of the questions that I've asked along the way and you want to share those with me, then leave them in the comments below or leave them in the live chat and I'll take a look and I'll respond as soon as I can and to the best of my abilities. Questions are very welcome, whether it's about the chapter or about something I've said or about the English syllabus or a question that you have about maybe the new CBSE pattern or anything like that. Questions are always welcome. So feel free to drop them in the comments. With that said, let's move into our first lesson, The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. Just gonna grab the laser pointer. So Khushwant Singh is a very famous person. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he has done a lot of things. He's been a politician, he's been a lawyer, he's been a journalist, and he's been a writer. So writer is just one of the many things that he's been. He has this very famous novel called Train to Pakistan. He's also well known for some of his short stories, and one of those is what we're going to read today. It's called The Portrait of a Lady. Now, titles usually give away something about the story that we're going to read, but this title is really vague. It doesn't tell us much, right? It just tells us that it's the portrait of a lady, some lady. We don't even get told who the lady in question is. What is a portrait? A portrait is an image of a person. It focuses on the features generally of a person or sometimes multiple people. It's like portrait mode on your phone. If you pick it up, then it's going to really zoom in on the features of someone's face. And that's kind of what a portrait does. It tries to recreate a person for you. And here Khushwant Singh isn't going to be giving us a portrait that is a literal portrait. He's not going to be telling us a story about an image of somebody, but instead he's going to be giving us a word portrait of somebody. He's going to be using his words to build an image of a person for us across the course of the story. It's like a character sketch, the sort of character sketch questions that you get in your exams. Yeah, Khushwant Singh is going to be giving us a character sketch of somebody in this story. And who is this mysterious lady? It is a grandmother, the narrator's grandmother. But before we get into the actual story itself, I want to take a moment and ask you, what's your relationship with your grandparents like? Are you close to them? Do you speak to them a lot? Do you get the chance to spend a lot of time with them? When I was younger, I used to spend a lot of time with my grandparents because I was in a joint family setup. I lived with my parents and my grandparents. But then we moved out to be closer to my school and I stopped seeing much of them, and now it's been almost a year since I've seen my grandparents, especially because of the pandemic. So given circumstances and conditions, it's been very difficult to be close to my grandparents and to share a very deep relationship with them. Maybe something of the sort has happened to you too, especially given COVID. Or maybe it happened across the course of time over the years, just a gentle sort of distance? If so, then you will completely understand the narrator in this story, because this is a story about a changing grandmother-grandson relationship. It's about the ways that this relationship moves and shifts across time, and it's about the reasons that the relationship shifts. So we go into this story and we are taken into the course of a relationship and the way that relationship is affected by multiple things around it. That is a very quick overview of our story. What we're going to be doing now is we're going to start reading the actual story. What I like to do when we start reading the story is I like to read a little bit of the story and we'll try to understand that segment together. And then after that, we'll look at some themes that the segment throws up for us. So that's the pattern that I generally follow. Let me know how that's working for you, again, in the comments, in the chat, whichever. And let's start. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. From the very beginning, the author tells us one thing. His grandmother is an old woman. The second thing, everybody's grandmother is an old woman. Now this seems like something that we should all take for granted, right? Grandmothers seem like old people. They're just old people. But it's also true that some people become grandparents at a very young age. My grandmother, for instance, still has dark hair. When I think about her, I don't think about her like that. I think about someone who's very old and immediately my mind says white hair. But she still has dark hair. So it is actually a possibility that grandparents can be young. But not for our narrator. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. This gives us an idea of the age of the narrator, somewhere around 20 plus. Because he's known his grandmother for that long at least. And he tells us that she has been old and wrinkled for all those 20 years. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. After telling us that his grandmother is old, the narrator immediately tells us that other people have told him that once upon a time, his grandmother had also been young, and she had even been pretty, and she had even had a husband. But the narrator says, I can't really imagine that. That doesn't sound real to me. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. The mantelpiece is sort of a shelf in the drawing room. And in the drawing room, there's a literal portrait, a literal image of the narrator's grandfather, who is actually the grandmother's husband. He wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. So this is how the portrait looks. In the portrait, the grandfather is wearing this big turban and he's wearing really loose clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. So this grandfather also seems like a very typical grandfather in the sense that the first thing the author mentions about him is a long white beard. White hair, white beards. This is very typical of grandparents, of the image of grandparents that we have in our minds. And the author goes on to add, he looks very old. So old that he looks at least like he was 100. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. So here the narrator is telling us, my grandfather looked so old. It seemed like he could only ever hold the role of a grandfather, meaning that he could only ever have grandchildren. It's not possible to imagine him as being any younger, as being the sort of person who has a wife, or the sort of person who has a children. This is all really funny because Of course, if you're going to become a grandfather, you need to have had a wife, had to have children, and then you have grandchildren. But here the narrator is like, no, he looks so old, he must have skipped all of those stages and gone straight to having grandchildren. It's just not possible that anything else happened in his life. As for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. This narrator finds even the idea that his grandmother could have been young and could have been pretty, he finds it disgusting. Revolting means disgusting. Repelling. He doesn't want to think about it. He thinks about it and he immediately goes, no. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child. So grandmother tells the narrator, and us presumably means other grandchildren, of the games that the grandmother used to play back when she was a tiny baby. That seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part. And we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. So again, the narrator is struggling to think of his grandmother as a younger person. So much so that when he thinks of her playing games, he can only imagine this old, grave, serious woman playing games. And he says, that seems absurd and undignified. Absurd meaning ridiculous, and undignified meaning not serious enough, not solemn enough, not serious enough, grave enough. And so he's like, this is not in line with the character of grandmother as we know her. Seems wrong to think that she could have played games, because that's too silly. It's too fun and childish an activity for grandmother to have played. And so this mysterious we, which is probably the grandchildren, treats these stories that the grandmother tells them about the games she played like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. Grandmother also tells them stories. Fables are generally fictional stories of the prophets. So these tales that she tells them of the prophets, that's what these games sound like to them. Something mythical, something that's a little removed from reality, something they can't entirely, completely believe in. This is a very quick couple of words that and phrases that we worked through in the last slide. I just put them here in case you want to maybe take a screenshot, or in case you want to come back at some time and look through this lesson and you can't find this segment where I'm talking about them. I thought slides like this would be an easier way for you to get to these little phrases and these little words that are maybe a little more difficult than the rest. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. This is a very short description of grandmother. She's always been tiny, and she's been a little plump, and she's been bent, stooped over, and her face is a crisscross of wrinkles from everywhere to everywhere, so there are wrinkles everywhere on her face. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her. So the narrator says, these two facts, this descriptive fact that she had always been short and fat and bent, and this fact that she had so many wrinkles across her face, this confirms it to the narrator that it is sure, it is truth that the grandmother has always been as the narrator has known her, which is old. Old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. So the narrator says she's so old that it's not possible she could have grown older. She has to have stayed this age for 20 years. Now, what does the narrator mean when he says she couldn't have grown older? Let me give you an example. He means that it's not possible. Take that the grandmother is now 60 years old, right? He thinks that it's not possible that 20 years ago she could have been 40 and that from 40 over those 20 years she slowly became 60. He thinks no, she's always been 60. That's how she's always been for the last 20 years. That's what he means by she couldn't have grown older over these last 20 years. She's just been the same. She could never have been pretty. And here pretty becomes associated with age. That's part of why the narrator can't really imagine the grandmother as pretty. He keeps repeating that she's so old that I can't imagine she could have been pretty. She's so old, I can't imagine that she could have been pretty. The thought of her as pretty and young is repelling to me. It's not something I want to think about because I can't imagine it. But she was always beautiful. And so beautiful becomes a word that is not associated with youth, and it also becomes a word that's different from pretty. And we'll see how it becomes a word that's different from pretty, what beauty means in this context in a couple of lines. She hobbled about the house in spotless white. So grandmother is stooped and she doesn't walk very well. She's sort of, walking unsteadily around the house, and she wears full white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop. So she's always walking around with one hand on her waist because she's trying to balance herself and her unbalanced walk, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. With her other hand she has a rosary. A rosary is a string of beads. You might have one in your house if your family is religious. You use it to basically, you go bead by bead and you say prayers as you go bead by bead. It helps you keep count of the number of times you've said a prayer. So generally there are a set number of beads in a rosary. What does telling the beads mean? Here, telling the beads means she is going through the beads with her fingers and she's telling the prayer. So with one hand on her waist and the other hand telling the rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face. She has white hair to match with the white clothing, and her hair is scattered very untidily over her face. Her face is also very pale. It doesn't have a lot of color in it, and it's puckered. Puckered means that your face, the corners of your face are scrunching together. It's referring to the wrinkles again a little bit. It's the expression that you make if, say, you suck on a lemon and your face scrunches together. That's what puckering means. And her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. And because she's telling the beads of the rosary, she's also saying her prayers, and she's not saying them very loudly. She's saying them in a way that makes them inaudible, which is to say not loud and not hearable. She's saying it to herself. Her lips are just moving. Yes, she was beautiful. So we understand that these traits of the grandmother are somehow associated with beauty. And the author goes on to explain how. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. So now we find out how and why the author thinks the grandmother is beautiful. Because she's like the winter landscape in the mountains. She is peaceful and content, and there is a calmness to her. And in that seriousness and in that calmness, the narrator finds beauty. Now, this last line here is a simile. The grandmother is being compared to the winter landscape in the mountains. It's an expanse of pure white, which means that it's stretches of pure white. Serenity meaning calmness and peacefulness. Breathing peace and contentment. Now, this is a really good comparison, not only because the pure white of the winter landscape, which is the snowy covers that show up in the mountains in the winter, compare well to the white clothing and the white hair of the grandmother, but also when it's winter on a mountain, it's generally very isolated on a mountain. there isn't a lot of movement, and because it's winter, the movement is even less. Plants and trees, for instance, are covered in snow, they aren't moving. Not many animals are moving. Hibernation is something that happens a lot in winter, so movement is low, there's a lot of stillness, and in that stillness there's a lot of peace, a lot of calmness, a lot of passiveness, and the narrator associates it with contentment also. Again, a quick slide with some of those meanings on that. I'm just going to leave it up for a second. Okay. Now, what are some themes that we get from these two paragraphs? One major theme that we get is a lot of characteristics about the grandmother. We get a bunch of her physical traits. We know how she looks. The wrinkles on her face are a lot. She's stooped, she is fat, she's slightly bent, she walks hobbling. One of her hands is gently on her waist, the other hand is telling a rosary. And all of these physical traits are things that we know. We also know what she wears. She wears white. And we also get quite some personality traits. One is definitely that she is religious, because she has a rosary in her hand all the time, to the extent that it's something that her grandson defines her by. It's one of the very first things that her grandson tells us about her. She also keeps saying prayers, so we know she's religious. We also know that she has quite a close relationship with her grandchildren, because she's telling them all of these stories, right? She's telling them about the prophets, which again says that maybe she's religious. But she's also telling them about herself when she was younger. She's telling them stories about herself as a child. So she's close to her grandchildren, and she seems to like telling stories. So these are a bunch of things that we found out about the grandmother. Another thing that we've definitely gotten from these two paragraphs is the opinion of the narrator on old age. We've gotten to see how a young person looks at old age, how they understand old age, how young people look at old people and think this is all there is to their life. Oldness is all there is. And sometimes young people struggle to imagine that old people could ever have been different from the way that they are now, and see them as younger people, as people who could have had a different kind of life, or held different positions, or been different in other ways. For instance, it's difficult even to imagine the grandmother as a wife, right? As someone who is something that's not a grandmother. And so that tells us a lot of very interesting things about how a younger person gets used to looking at an older person and looking at them in the way that that older person has always been in their lives. So to me, she's always been my grandmother, and so that's all that she has ever been, grandmother. So that's something that we've also gotten from these two paragraphs. My grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. So the narrator and his grandmother are good friends, and part of the reason why is that when the narrator was young, his parents left him with the grandmother and they went to live in the city, probably to work. So grandmother and narrator spent all their time together, they lived together, and they were each other's only companions because the grandfather is dead and because the parents are living in the city. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. So grandmother used to take care of the narrator to the extent that every morning she'd be the one waking him up, getting him ready. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song while she bathed and dressed me, in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. So as she bathes him, as she dresses him, she'll keep saying a prayer in a monotonous means a single tone. So a repetitive chanting kind of song. She'll keep saying prayers in a chanting repetitive tune, a sort of dull tune because there's only one tune to it. And the reason that she does this is because she hopes that the narrator will listen to it, and so he'll also get to know it by heart, which means he'll memorize it. I listened because I loved her voice, but never bothered to learn it. And the narrator tells us, I did listen to her because I liked her voice, but though she really hoped that I would learn it, I didn't actually learn it because I didn't bother, I didn't care to. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk. This gives us an idea of the time in which this story is set, because people are still using wooden slates. The grandmother would go and get the narrator's wooden slate. She'd wash it, she'd plaster it with chalk so that he could write on it, and she'd get him a tiny earthen ink pot, an ink pot made of earth, and a red pen, and then she would tie them all in a bundle and hand it to me. So she'd put all these things together and she'd give it to him. After a breakfast of a thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. They'd have breakfast together and then they'd go to school together. And on the way, she'd carry chapatis with her for the dogs, which she is going to feed. So this is a sort of description of their everyday life. Monotonous. I'm going to give you a second again here. This slide. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. Now we get an idea of what sort of school the narrator went to when he was younger also. It was a school attached to a temple, and so grandmother used to go to school with the narrator, and she'd go to the temple and he'd go to school. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer. So part of the schooling that was going on for the narrator, not only is he learning the alphabet, he is also learning prayers. So both of these things, a letter-oriented education, the general education as you and I may know it in our schools, learning the alphabet was going on, but a religious education was also going on the side. While the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda, singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus, so the children would sit in rows on different sides of the veranda and they'd be singing the alphabet or they'd be singing the prayers. My grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. Scriptures are holy books. So while the children are doing this, while they're attending their school, the narrator's grandmother would sit in the temple and she would be reading the religious books, the religious texts. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. When they're both done with their different work at the school temple, they'd both walk back together. This time, the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis we threw to them. So all the chapatis that the grandmother has brought with her, the narrator and the grandmother throw it to the dogs on their way home. The dogs keep following them all the way. They keep growling, they keep making noises and fighting with each other for the chapatis. And this is a regular thing that the narrator and the grandmother do. And we know this because the dogs meet them at the temple door to be fed. So the dogs are used to being fed at this particular time by the grandmother and the narrator, and so they show up at that time in order to get their food. Again, let's go into the themes of those last two paragraphs. First, this is a description of the narrator's early childhood. It's a time when he is not living with his parents, he is living with his grandmother. She is his sole caregiver. She is the only person in his life who is taking care of him at this moment. She is his only guardian. She's taking care of him completely, entirely. And she is also his friend, and they're also quite close. A joint routine to their days bringing closeness. They both spend their entire days together. from the morning when she wakes him up to them going to school, to them coming back home together. They spend all their time together from to every second, right? And they do things together, and because of this there's a routine to their days that they build together, and that routine also brings some sort of closeness, because if you're spending that much time with someone, you get to know them quite a bit, and you get to know their habits, and you get used to being around them, and they start to mean something to you. You grow attached to them, you end up having some sort of relationship with them, and in this case it's a good relationship. They're both friends, they both seem to enjoy each other's company. And a third thing that we get from these two paragraphs is that the grandmother wants the narrator to also be religious. We know this from two things. One, the fact that the school that he goes to is one in which he is being taught prayers, and two, the grandmother is also trying to teach him prayers by singing them to him in the mornings and hoping that he'll just pick them up. So we know that the grandmother wants him to be religious. And we can understand why, because she herself is also very, very religious. When my parents were comfortably settled in the city, they sent for us. So once the narrator's parents are settled into the city and they're relatively comfortable there, they call the grandmother and the narrator to the city. That was a turning point in our friendship, and this is when things begin to change for the two of them. Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school with me. I used to go to an English school in a motor bus. There were no dogs in the streets, and she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of our city house. So the narrator tells us that when they move to a new place, and they move into a place where his parents are also there and they also make decisions, something between the author and the grandmother changes. They still live together, and in fact they live in the same room together, so they're living very, very closely together. But all the routine that we read about in those last two paragraphs has been destroyed. In just 3 lines, we know that all of it is gone. No longer does grandmother take the narrator to school, and the narrator no longer goes to a temple school. The narrator now goes to an English school, and the narrator goes through a bus. And there are no dogs in the streets, so the grandmother isn't feeding dogs anymore. The narrator and the grandmother aren't feeding dogs together anymore. And the narrator's grandmother takes to feeding sparrows instead. But we know that the narrator doesn't join her. So we can see already that all of those habits, all of those things that they did together, that routine is gone. As the years rolled by, we saw less of each other. And so, because we know that this routine is gone already, we expect this line, right? We expect to be told that the narrator and the grandmother are sharing less time together, simply because their lives are going in slightly different directions now. For some time, she continued to wake me up and get me ready for school. For a little bit, in the beginning when they get into the city, the grandmother still tries to wake the narrator up and gets him ready for school. When I came back, she would ask me what the teacher had taught me. And when he comes back, because she hasn't gotten to see what he learns in school like she used to see while she was in the village with him, she asks him what he's been taught that day. I would tell her English words and little things of Western science and learning, the law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the world being round, etc. So the narrator tells her all of these things that he is learning, which are all Western things. The things that you and I are learning in school, again, science, the law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the world being round. This made her unhappy. Grandmother, however, isn't happy with what the narrator is learning. She could not help me with my lessons. She did not believe in the things they taught at the English school and was distressed that there was no teaching about God and the scriptures. So grandmother listens to what the narrator says about what he learns in school, but she's not very happy listening to it. The first reason she's not happy is that she can't help him with his lessons anymore, because these are all things that she doesn't know about, and in fact things that she doesn't believe in. She doesn't really think these things are serious, important, or even real. And she is also upset that there's no talking about God. There's no religious education that's happening alongside this alphabet scientific oriented learning. And that upsets her because, as we know, she is very religious. One day I announced that we were being given music lessons. So the author says that he is learning music in school. Sorry, the narrator says that he's learning music in school. She was very disturbed, and the grandmother is more upset than she has been so far. To her, music had lewd associations. What does lewd mean? Lewd means ugly, dirty, disgusting associations. To her, music is not a good thing, and learning music is not a good thing. It's a very bad thing. It's a thing that is disgusting. It was the monopoly of harlots and beggars, and not meant for gentlefolk. So why does music mean bad things to the grandmother? Because to her it's associated with harlots and beggars. It is in fact the monopoly. Monopoly means exclusive property, which means that she thinks only harlots and beggars are allowed to do music, and that's what these people do. And she thinks that these people are unworthy. She has derogatory, bad opinions about these people. And she thinks that music is not meant for gentlefolk. Gentlefolk is how she views herself and her grandson and her family. It's a difference in class. Generally, in society, if somebody is considered to be gentlefolk, a gentleman or a gentle lady, then they're meant to be socio-economically in a better place, in a higher position. Unlike these people who are considered to be in a lower place, they don't get much social respect, and they don't have much economic power or importance, which is in contrast to the gentlefolk. She said nothing, but her silence meant disapproval. The grandmother doesn't actually tell the narrator that she doesn't like this, but the narrator knows that because she's saying nothing and she's only being silent, she's not, say, giving him positive approval or encouragement or anything of the sort, that she doesn't approve of this. She thinks this is wrong. She rarely talked to me after that. And after she finds out about the fact that the narrator is learning music in his school, she doesn't talk to him much anymore. Now, couple of things, again, a bunch of themes. So we see a shift in place, a shift in age. This is the more adolescent period. The narrator is growing up and learning about the sciences, growing older, and many changes in the relationship is happening as a consequence of the change in location and the change in schooling. There's still a lot of closeness in sharing a space, right? For instance, in the beginning, she's still waking him up. So there's still something of a routine because they still live together in the same room, and it's a very close space, it's a very small space. And so they still see each other sometimes, and they still speak to each other sometimes. And they still have some small habits together. But circumstance, which is just the fact that he now goes to a school to which she can't take him, and he now learns things that she can't help him with. Both of those things inevitably cause some kind of separation between the two of them. There's no longer that joint routine. And there is also disagreement. Grandmother doesn't think that the things that the narrator is learning are acceptable. She doesn't think that these things are good to learn, and so she can't entirely like what's going on in his life right now. So no longer is it true that she is no longer with him most of the day. Now she only spends very little parts of the day with him. She also no longer understands him entirely. She can't understand what he's studying, but she also can't understand the decisions he's making, like learning music. It doesn't make sense to her at all, because to her that's a bad thing. And so now, because of that, she can't really associate with him very much. And it's especially this lack of understanding that makes it difficult for them to have a relationship, right? And we know that because we know that they still shared somewhat of a relationship in the beginning. She still did some things for him. And then she finds out about this music thing. And she's so disturbed that she can't even talk to him much after that, because she can't understand him at all. And she can't understand what he's doing at all. And in fact, she dislikes it. It's a very negative kind of lack of understanding. When I went up to university, I was given a room of my own. The common link of friendship was snapped. So the author goes to university. So this is another new phase of his life. The narrator goes to university. I'm sorry, I keep saying the author. But yeah, the narrator goes to university, and the narrator is given a room of his own. It's a new phase of his life, university, a separate room. That common link of friendship was snapped, which is to say that same space that they were sharing, which kept them together and a little bit in touch, now it's gone. That also has been taken away. My grandmother accepted her seclusion with resignation. Seclusion means solitude or loneliness. Resignation means a sense of giving up. So grandmother has accepted that she is kind of just going to be alone now, and she's sort of a little hopeless and a little tired, and okay, fine, this is what it is about it. She rarely left her spinning wheel to talk to anyone. Grandmother doesn't really talk to anybody anymore. She keeps like sitting at her spinning wheel, and that's what she does the whole day. From sunrise to sunset, she sat by her wheel spinning and reciting prayers. Only in the afternoon she relaxed for a while to feed the sparrows. So this is grandmother's new routine. She sits by the spinning wheel and she is still reciting prayers. And she takes a tiny break in the afternoon when she goes and she feeds the sparrows, which are her substitutes for the dogs. While she sat in the veranda, breaking the bread into little bits, hundreds of little birds collected around her, creating a veritable bedlam of chirpings. So grandmother sits in the veranda and she breaks the bread into little pieces, and she's throwing the bread out. And while she's doing that, birds are collecting around her in hundreds. That's a lot of birds. And they're creating a veritable bedlam of chirpings. Chirpings is the sound that they're making. A veritable bedlam. Bedlam is chaos. Veritable is definite. Like, together, that phrase, a veritable bedlam of chirpings, it means they are definitely making a lot of chaotic noise. Some came and perched on her legs, others on her shoulders. Some of these birds come and sit on her legs, some of these birds come and sit on her shoulders, some even sat on her head, and some even come and sit on her head. She smiled, but never shooed them away. Grandmother smiles at them, and she doesn't ever tell them to get off her. So she's enjoying it. It's a form of connecting with something, some living thing, right? She's having some sort of a relationship with these sparrows. It's a friendship that she's found there. It used to be the happiest half hour of the day for her. And this half an hour is the half an hour in the day that the grandmother is the happiest. Couple of words again. And now, a couple of themes. The physical distance, the fact that the room is no longer shared, leads to even more distance between these two characters. So much so that the grandmother is now resigned to almost complete isolation. And from that, we find out that her grandson is the person that she was maybe closest to, that she shared most of her social interactions with. Because once her grandson moves out, she doesn't talk to anybody anymore. It's like there's almost no one left for her to talk to. And so the grandmother retreats and she starts doing things that she enjoys, that she can do on her own too, like praying, like spinning, and like feeding the sparrows. When I decided to go abroad for further studies, I was sure my grandmother would be upset. The narrator decides that he is going to go abroad for more studies after his university, and he thinks, oh no, my grandmama is going to be upset. I would be away for 5 years, and at her age, one could never tell. So the narrator says that his further studies are going to take up at least 5 years of time, and he is not going to be able to come home during that time. And he says, at her age, one could never tell. Now, he doesn't say what one can't tell, but what he means here is that she's really old, and it's not possible to say when she will live or when she will pass away. It's simply not possible to guess at which point she might die, and you can't tell when she is going to die. And he thinks that's part of the reason that she's going to be upset, that he's not going to be around to see her for maybe the last years of her life. But my grandmother could what? Could tell. Here the narrator is suggesting that his grandmother could tell when she's going to die. She was not even sentimental. So his grandmother isn't upset in the least, even though he expects her to be. She came to leave me at the railway station but did not talk or show any emotion. Her lips moved in prayer. Her mind was lost in prayer. Her fingers were busy telling the beads of her rosary. Grandmother comes with him all the way to the railway station and she drops him off, but she doesn't talk to him. She doesn't show any sort of emotion. She doesn't even seem to be really present in the moment. She is praying as always. She is telling the beads of her rosary as always. And it seems like her entire mind and being is focused in prayer. She's not really paying much attention or giving much investment to other things that are going on around her. Silently, she kissed my forehead, and when I left, I cherished the moist imprint as perhaps the last sign of physical contact between us. She kisses his forehead in goodbye, and the narrator is leaving. And as the narrator leaves, he cherishes, which means he treasures, the moist imprint, the lingering sort of wetness of her kiss. He treasures it because he thinks that this might be the last physical contact that they both have. So he really is worried that maybe he won't ever get to see her again, and so he's really taking care to treasure this moment. But that was not so. But that's not what happens. After 5 years, I came back home and was met by her at the station. 5 years later, he comes back and she is there at the station again to meet him. So she is still very much alive. In fact, she did not look a day older. For the first time, she isn't older. She seems just as she was 5 years ago. She still had no time for words, and while she clasped me in her arms, I could hear her reciting her prayers. Her prayers have become the single focus of her life, to the point that even when the narrator has come back after 5 years, she doesn't talk to him. She doesn't say a single word to him. She's just reciting her prayers on and on. So we can see that this is the center of her life now, this praying. Even on the first day of my arrival, her happiest moments were with her sparrows, whom she fed longer and with frivolous rebukes. Even when the narrator returns, even when it's the very first day of seeing him after 5 years, The happiest time that the grandmother is spending in that day is still with her sparrows. She feeds them and she gives them frivolous rebukes, which means silly. Frivolous means silly, sort of careless, not very serious. Rebukes means scoldings. So it's like that fun sort of scolding that people sometimes give things that they love very much or people that they love very much, that isn't meant to be taken very seriously. And these are some of the themes that we see in those two paragraphs. There is a sense of foretelling, in the sense that the grandmother seems to be able to tell when she's going to die or when she's not going to die. And there's mutual distance, which means that not only is the narrator no longer close to the grandmother is also no longer very close to the narrator. This is something that's been happening for a lot of time now, but now it's definitely established, especially because we see how the grandmother has different priorities now. Even when the narrator comes back, her first focus is the prayer, her first happiness is the sparrows. So we can see that the closeness is not there on the side of the grandmother as well. In the evening, a change came over her. She did not pray. The grandmother, who has been praying all this time, to the extent that she's been praying even the moment that she meets her grandson after 5 years, is not praying. This is a very sudden thing, and this is a very odd thing. She collected the women of the neighborhood, got an old drum, and started to sing. She gathers up all the women, she gets this old drum, and she starts to sing. For several hours, she thumped the sagging skins of the dilapidated drum and sang of the homecoming of warriors. So she's thumping, banging the sagging skins of the dilapidated drum. Dilapidated means worn out, it's a very old drum. And sagging skins means the drum is made with skins, animal skins, and it's stretched tight. But over time, because it's been used so much and it's worn out and it's old, which is what dilapidated means, it's worn out. And so the skin, which is supposed to be stretched tight to make the best kind of noise, is starting to sag, which means go in, not be as tight anymore. And so she is banging these drums and she's singing songs about the homecoming of warriors. And it's the homecoming of the narrator today. We had to persuade her to stop, to avoid overstraining. The family tries to get the grandmother to stop because they think that she shouldn't stress herself out so much and do so much. That was the first time since I had known her that she did not pray. It's the very first time since the narrator has ever known her that the grandmother does not pray. It's also the very first time that we've known her across this story that she is not praying. The next morning, she was taken ill. It was a mild fever, and the doctor told us that it would go. So the very next morning, the grandmother falls sick, and the doctor comes, and the doctor says, okay, it's just a fever, she's going to be fine. But my grandmother thought differently. She told us that her end was near. The grandmother says, I don't care what the doctor says, I know what's going to happen, and I'm about to die. She said that since only a few hours before the close of the last chapter of her life she had omitted to pray, she was not going to waste any more time talking to us. The grandmother says, you know, I am so close to the last chapter of my life. The last chapter of her life meaning the very ending of her life. And yet, only a few hours before it, just yesterday, I didn't pray. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop wasting my time talking to you and instead I'm going to pray. We protested. The family is like, what do you mean you're not going to talk to us? But she ignored our protests. But the grandmother just ignores them. She lay peacefully in bed, praying and telling her beads. Even before we could suspect, her lips stopped moving and the rosary fell from her lifeless fingers. A peaceful pallor spread on her face, and we knew that she was dead. The grandmother lies down in bed, she's praying, she's telling her beads, and even as she's praying, she stops speaking, and the rosary, which she's been holding in her hand throughout all the time that we've known her, falls from her fingers. She dies, and it seems as though peaceful pallor, which is peaceful shade, spreads on her face. So it seems as though peace has come upon her and she is dead. So in the end, the grandmother does sense her own death, and in the end, it is not family that she is focused on. It is not the people around her. It is her prayers, which she is given the utmost importance in her life until all this time. That becomes the center of her life, even at its very end, and very deliberately so. She makes the decision not to talk to her family, and she makes the decision to pray because she knows that it's the very end of her life. It's not like she thinks, oh, I'll have tomorrow to talk to my family. She says, no, this is the last bit of my life and I don't want to talk to you, I want to pray. We lifted her off the bed and, as is customary, laid her on the ground and covered her with a red shroud. A shroud is a cloth, so they're performing their traditional funeral functions. They lift her off the bed, they put her on the ground, they cover her with a red cloth. After a few hours of mourning, we left her alone to make arrangements for her funeral. In the evening, we went to her room with a crude stretcher to take her to be cremated. They go and make arrangements for her funeral, and then they take her in a stretcher, they take her body to cremate her. The sun was setting and had lit her room and veranda with a blaze of golden light. The sun is setting, the day is ending, and this ties in well with the fact that the grandmother's life is over. It's the end of a day, it's the end of the life, and they're about to take her to be cremated. And the sun has lit up her room, it has lit up the veranda in a blaze of golden light. And this blaze of golden light also reminds us of the fire and the cremation to be. We stopped halfway in the courtyard. All over the veranda and in her room right up to where she lay, dead and stiff, wrapped in the red shroud, thousands of sparrows sat scattered on the floor. As the family is walking into the courtyard, they all suddenly stop, because all over the veranda and in the grandmother's room, right up to where she is lying there on the floor, dead, sparrows are everywhere. There was no chirruping, and they're making no noise for the first time. We felt sorry for the birds, and my mother fetched some bread for them. The family feels bad for the birds, which are used to the grandmother feeding them, and so the narrator's mother goes and gets some bread. She broke it into little crumbs the way my grandmother used to and threw it to them. She breaks it up and she throws it to the birds. The sparrows took no notice of the bread, but the sparrows pay absolutely no attention to the bread. When we carried my grandmother's corpse off, they flew away quietly. When they take the grandmother's body away, the sparrows fly away too. Next morning, the sweeper swept the breadcrumbs into the dustbin. The breadcrumbs that the mother throws out lies there until the next morning. The sweeper sweeps the breadcrumbs into the dustbin the next morning. That's how long they just lie there, which tells us that the birds didn't come back to eat, and they just left the bread there. And that brings us to a closing theme, which is the love of these birds for the grandmother, which is very, very special and very, very touching. Grandmother has been feeding them for all this time, and in the very end, the birds indicate their own love and their own respect and their own sorrow that she is no longer around in two acts. One, they're no longer making noise, so the silence is a sign of respect and sorrow expressed by the birds for the grandmother's death. And two, they don't eat the food, which is to say they're not there for the food, right? They were also there for the grandmother. And so when it's no longer the grandmother who is feeding them, they don't want to eat that food. They leave the food there and they fly away quietly when her body is taken away. And so the very last closing thing in this lesson is that love that the grandmother shared with the birds, that relationship that she shared and formed with the birds, and the way those birds express something for her in turn. And this is how this specific lesson closes. Now, there's just one very big theme that we can think about with regard to this lesson that we haven't talked about so far. And it is the question of how the author, the narrator and the grandmother grow apart. Across time, we see that their relationship actually dies down. It becomes less and less important to the narrator and to the grandmother. It becomes less meaningful, less close, more distant. They don't spend time together. They maybe don't care for each other also as much as they used to earlier. But for all this, the narrator doesn't write this story in a tone of regret. The narrator doesn't say, oh, I wish things had been different. There's more a tone of acceptance. The narrator tells the story as though it's just how it happened. And that's a very interesting tone with which to tell this story. It's fascinating because the narrator doesn't seem to say, oh, this is a bad way to live, or this is not the way to live. The narrator just says, this is just how things happened. A lot of things in life came together and made our relationship this way across time, and it couldn't be helped. And that's a very good approach to have with a lot of things in general, right? Especially relationships with people, because it does happen that very often things come around that change the ways that we are with people, that change the ways that we connect with people, that make us different people, that make the people around us different, and then something about the two of us together doesn't entirely work anymore. Things like that happen, and that's sort of what happens in the story. It's a grandmother and a grandson who grow apart, who used to be very close, but things in their life change. Part of it is circumstance. It's the fact that they don't do all their everyday activities together anymore. Part of it is just time. They're both headed in different directions in their lives. They have different points of focus. And part of it is incompatibility of their beliefs. The narrator is doing Western school and the grandmother isn't very pleased that the narrator isn't religious. So all of these things come together and separate them. And this is something that does happen. And that's the sort of thing that the portrait of a lady winds up telling us. And that is the end of our lesson. If you have any questions or any comments or anything else, any other ideas that you want to discuss, then do drop me a comment and I will get back to you. We have gone very over time. It's been an hour and 10 minutes, but please stay with me for just a little bit more time. And this is just something I want to let you know about. It's called How to Ask a Doubt. It's a segment on the Unacademy app. If you download the Unacademy app, then you can basically ask a doubt to educators. You can sort of click on Ask a Doubt and you can take a picture or upload an image of the question, and you can crop it if you want to highlight a specific question, and you'll have to tell us which subject the question falls under, and you will receive an answer about the doubt very soon. This is something I wanted to let you know about, and something else I want to let you know about, which you've maybe heard about a lot, but I'm just going to tell you about it again, is the Unacademy Plus subscription. There's a lot of extra features on the app itself. There are quizzes, and there are some study materials, and there is a bunch of mock tests. But in case you want access to all the courses that are available, and you want access to more study material and more practice tests, then Unacademy Plus is the way to go. It will give you access to all of those things. This is the pricing for Unacademy Plus. A variety of prices, a variety of times, and as you can see, the prices reduce as you keep going further and further. As you take a subscription for longer and longer, the per month costs reduce, is what I mean. There is also something called Unacademy Iconic. This is an upgraded version of Plus, in the sense that if you're looking for an individual plan, if you're looking for someone to help you out personally, if you're looking for reports on your personal work, if you want your parents to maybe get feedback on how you're doing and things like that, then Iconic lets you get access to all of those features. You will work closely with a personal mentor who will help you out. Again, Iconic has a set of different plans for different durations, different costs, and again, the cost varies per month based on how long you sign up for. So that's something to keep in mind if you want to get an Unacademy Iconic subscription or an Unacademy Plus subscription. I also want to let you know that if you want to get a Plus subscription, you can use my code, which is THAR01. It's down in the description box below, and it will give you 10% off on the Plus subscription. If you like today's session, then do like and subscribe, and if you have any questions, comments, any feedback, then please leave them in the comment section. Thanks for being here today, and I will see you again soon.